And I think that is a really important, complicated dynamic, and losing sight of that would be a very bad thing for everyone.
I mean, there are some hopes, aren't there, that perhaps the Iranian attack is as much a show of strength rather than an actual meaningful military intervention.
They were sort of flagged up a long time in advance.
Absolutely, they were
a long time to get there.
Totally, the warning meant they could be shot down. There were no casualties. So I guess this pressure for de-escalation, as your interview with Kathy Ashdown emphasised, is really where all the efforts have to be concentrated, and that as much as the UK can do to help in that effort to de-escalate, the better.
But I'm sure some voters might be concerned that this happened and there is UK military involvement without Parliament having any say. Do you feel that's a live issue at the moment, or not?
Well, there are some. Well, the Lib Dems have said we have to have a full debate in the House and possibly even a retrospective vote on UK involvement. I mean, it feels a little bit ritualistic to me, that call. But clearly, as Michael said, there's very, very complex issues at play. I wonder how the left will react, as you indicated in your question, Ben, now that Iran is a bit more of a player in the situation, because that's not a regime that the left is presumably find as attractive as Israel's enemy.
Okay, and presumably there'll be a statement from Rishi Sunak in the Commons tomorrow. And do you detect nervousness in the heart of government about where this is going?
Listen, we're expecting the statement yet to be confirmed from number 10, and that's what Labour has been calling for. I think there is a nervousness going back to what David Cameron said, a few months ago about, the dashboard flashing red, that this could spiral, and therefore I think, as we talk about what various UK politicians think, but I think the big question is how does Israel respond, because that is what's going to really decide if this is an escalation, which then leads to lots more effects and responses potentially from Iran, or will it be something more moderate, which might then mean that things don't head off in that direction.
You're listening to the Westminster Hour with me, Ben Wright, and my guest, the Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour's Meg Hillier, Miranda Green from the Financial Times, and the Spectator's political editor Katie Balls. Well, Parliament is back from its Easter break tomorrow after a fairly odd recess dominated by a honey trap sexting scandal and a social media meltdown over Rishi Sunak's choice of trainers. The Prime Minister will certainly hope to get on the political front foot this week, with the government's Miranda Bill expected to clear Parliament for take-off, and MPs set to vote on number 10's plan to phase out smoking altogether. We'll also get fresh inflation figures on Wednesday. Katie, set the scene for tomorrow's return. Tory MPs went away for the Easter break, I think feeling pretty bleak about their party's prospects. Are they going to be returning any cheerier?
I think they'll still be pretty bleak. I mean, you've got one in the studio who's probably about to disagree with me. Matt is smiling, I would say, for the record. But no, I mean, I think
it's a rueful smile. I'd say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you can probably say is over the recess, I'm not sure things have got significantly worse for the Tories. I just think they're already in quite a low position. I think when you speak to Tory MPs, one of the best things they have to say, which is cheering them, is, well, Labour are in trouble too. Look at Angela Rayner and all these allegations over her. What's going on, with her council house sales dating back to 2015. I think the question is, can Rishi Sunak cheer his troops ahead of what we know are going to be very difficult local elections in May? Because in a way, that feels as though Westminster is a bit of a standstill until we get to those. Questions of Tory plotters, moves against him, election dates, which could be June or, January, and so forth. So I think that when you're looking at what is coming up in the Commons this week, because the Safety of Rwanda bill is going to be the one that potentially has the best outcome for Rishi Sunak, which is back in the Commons on Monday, then the Lord's Tuesday, could then be back again in the Commons on Wednesday, depending how it goes. If that becomes law by the end of the week and reaches royal assent, that is going to be something which at least makes Tory MPs believe one of those missions might be about to be met. Red tape aside coming up.
We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Just back to Angela Rayner briefly. I mean, this is the story that won't go away. Labour would love to be talking about other things, but at the moment, it can't. It keeps coming back to this.
Yes, and I think as soon as we talk about this, I'm sure there'll be some people listening saying this story is a nothing burger. It dates back to before she was an MP. Why is it so frequent? But I think it was much easier to say that before Friday when the police said that they are investigating it, because that was the line being used by supporters of Angela Rayner, some of the Labour team say this is a Tory smear, and the police aren't even reopening it. I think just the fact of an investigation means that it's harder for the Labour leadership to ignore, and there is now a question which is, is very murky or opaque, perhaps is the better word, about what exactly the police are investigating and what might actually happen. It seems as though there are limits, and there are two things that it could potentially be, which is one is, did Angela Rayner break electoral law when it came to her primary residence that she was registered for and where she was staying, if she was, as alleged, staying at her husband's home, her then husband's home, as her primary residence. Then there's also a question of capital gains tax. Angela Rayner has said she will step down if she is found guilty of an offence, which I think is generally seen as quite unlikely that would be the outcome, but it does mean it is possible.
It was what they said during the Beergate saga, wasn't it?
Exactly, but it is quite possible. Right now, I think what it is doing is blunting Labour's local campaign message and making it so it's quite hard for them to go out in the media and have one of the most effective media performances, Angela Rayner, go out. But it does mean there is a possible chance this gets much more serious if the police come back with this, but we're just not going to know for some time, and in the meantime it's just hanging over them.
Yeah, Mag, it is a big distraction, isn't it? And the Labour Party somehow has managed to let this drag on for weeks.
Well, I think, the police have said they will investigate, so that has happened. Well, look, Angela is a great asset to the Labour Party, and actually I hope to the country if she becomes Deputy Prime Minister. And she's a very honest and straight-talking woman. So when she's said very candidly, if I'm found guilty of something criminal, I will resign. I think that's pretty bold. I think that's pretty clear. But in the meantime, we have to now wait for the police investigation to run its course. I hope they do it quite quickly, because this is quite a big impact on our democracy to have someone as senior as her being investigated, and it needs to be resolved very quickly. And then, yes, we can then move on.
Matt, Katie suggests your colleagues are sort of clinging on to this as a shred of hope. Is that how you see it?
I don't see it as a shred of hope. I do think this is, to some extent, an emblematic thing, right? The question that it is reasonable of Conservative MPs to ask of the Labour Party is, how do you deal with scrutiny? What do you do when there are accusations that are made that, presumably, if they are disprovable, then you could make them go away? So I think it's, how do we try and scrutinise the Labour Party as we get closer to an election? This is just going to be the first of many where the question has to be, what are the values you're bringing to this job? What's the transparency? Where do we go from here?
Over the Easter recess, the number of Tory MPs saying they'll be standing down at the next election ticked up to 64. That's a pretty ominous sign, isn't it?
Well, these similar numbers have been seen at similar points in the political cycle
towards the end of a government,
when parties have been in power for a long time, which is not necessarily the same thing. But I think, you're absolutely right. Those numbers of people standing down tells us something about where some people think we are in the political cycle. I don't think that's a given myself, but it also tells
we hear about letters of no confidence. We hear about losing his authority over the party.
I think what it tells me, to be honest, is most of these people who are standing down have not been MPs for 20, 30, 40 years. It tells you something about the current nature of politics, is that these people who are relatively young, they started relatively young in many cases. It's not perceived as the job that is the climax of a career in the way that it used to be, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing of itself.
But do you think anything can save your electoral bacon?
Oh,
I mean, do you really think this is still retrievable?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that for two reasons. I think it partly because of the policies that the Prime Minister is pursuing, whether that's around Rwanda this week, whether it's around the economy, whether it's around inflation, all of those things that I think in the next few months will start to translate into something that people feel much more keenly. But I also think when you look at the quality of the opposition, I don't have a single person in my constituency that has said to me that they think that Keir Starmer is some kind of Tony Blair. We need to be realistic about what the options are for the British people, and that idea...
Well, they're doing a lot better in the polls, aren't they?
No, exactly.
Of course, Skegness is perhaps not a natural Labour territory.
Well, in 97 and 2001, the majority was 600 for the Conservatives. So I shouldn't be complacent on any of this stuff. But I do think it's right to say, look at what the potential prospect is. I don't see many people that are enthusiastic about that.
Miranda Green, how do you see the lie of the land as MPs come back tomorrow?
So I think everyone's right to say that Rishi Sunak could get a bit of a fillip if they get this Rwanda bill through. Clearly they feel running this story as hard as possible on Angela Rayner is a very useful way to spike Labour's campaigning guns. And I do agree with one thing that Matt said, which is that as a dry run for how Labour handles these stories, not just in an election campaign, but possibly in government, I think it's not been handled that brilliantly by the Labour leadership. Why is this story still running if there's nothing to report? You have to ask. But I think, these little sort of bits of hope, and possibly the inflation figures which we're expecting this week as well, might give the Treasury something to crow about. All it can do, really, is sort of mitigate the severity of a Tory defeat, I think. But that probably is the game plan now. And so some of it, particularly the Rwanda issue, is about talking to those voters that they can retain, maybe tempting some of the don't knows, some of the sit on their hands voters back from flirting with the Reform Party or just staying away on polling day. And I think Katie's right. I think those local election results will be very bad. Of course, the last time these seats were up in 2021, the Tory party did very well. It was the Boris jab bounce that they enjoyed. And the thing is, I think even though the Tory party is prepared for a bad night on the 2nd of May, it's a different thing knowing you're going to get a punch in the face. It still really hurts when you get that punch. And so when they're reeling from it, I think you probably will get a lot of these stories about Sunak's leadership resurfacing, and then we'll be back into that whole cycle of leadership speculation.
Let's not overplay Rwanda, though. I mean, the right and wrongs of the side, even if it passes, the challenge of then doing anything about it and actually stopping the vote is enormous. It's not a probing deterrent. There's just great hope that £500 million being blown on this so far, or projected to be so far, with not a single asylum seeker on a plane. Now, I don't agree with the policy, but even on its own terms, I don't think it's going to work. And so I think the British voters aren't that stupid either.
And at the same time, the Rwanda bill arrives in the Commons tomorrow, Meg. Your committee is going to be grilling the top civil servant, isn't it, at the Home Office, Matthew Rycroft, about Rwanda. What do you want to know from him?
Well, we were pretty annoyed. We were there with Chair of the Home Affairs Secretary, Brian Johnson, and her deputy, Tim Lawton, as well. They'll be joining us because we're cross that we weren't told about these costs. We took the National Audit Office to go in what the cost of this department was extraordinary. Which has been planned, and pinning them down, and actually looking at really pulling apart all to reveal my entire life, especially we're also looking at. I think about that bit, I think the Home Secretary is aware of, and are really any great thing, but we're also looking at the cost of the big asylum accommodation sites, those RAF bases, the biggest stock farm, and the National Audit Office has already shown that they're actually going to cost more than the hotels that people already, and that's not a good thing to have people in hotels, but these proposals and what, and they've actually blown money on sites that they're never going to use, but it is millions of taxpayers' money that's being spent. Matt and I are both on the committee. We may have different politics, but we both care about taxpayers' money being spent well on whatever we think is the policy. We look at the policy, that we look at the money, and I think we'll be pursuing that together tomorrow.
Katie, this is always meant to be a big vote winner for Rishi Sunak. Do you think it's backfired in the way that it has been delayed and delayed and delayed? Or do you think it could yet give him some sort of lift off?
I think as it stands, it's having a negative effect with the Conservative Party because the 2019 voters that they want to keep moving towards reform, and I think talking about stopping the vote and not being able to point to anything so you're doing it will kind of look as though incompetent because of being delayed. Some of that is out of their hands. We're finding actually if it is a vote you use. I still think it's possible that you could reach with the Conservative voters if they can get them back. There is a big fact about the tariff. This is about election timing. The situation about night to start, there's a couple, and you don't have time to get the tariff back before you're in election. So I think most of all TV pictures, it's like, well, you want to come out of Browse and the room of the telegraph front page, or even aircraft. And also I think it's something just because there's been so much talk about waiver and reform that this scheme is unworkable. To the point that the way people would flight, the act of having even just 1 or 2 flights, I think we just don't know what it would be, but it could be a bit of a game changer for where the boys are right now. But there's lots of opportunities. If it becomes law this week, there's quite a lot of obstacles before you get a flight step. So it's the first step you need, and that alone is not enough.
Well, so far the government handed over, I think it's £240 million for the Rwanda scheme, a further 50 million quid due this month. So far, no flights have taken off. The small boats keep coming. You are on Meg's committee. Do you think that this is proving good value for money for the taxpayers?
Well, the answer is time will tell, right? The question that...
A lot of money to hand over.
Absolutely, but we are spending billions of pounds on hotels and associated things with illegal migration as things stand. And that's why it's going to be an interesting question for the PAC. I think this is in some ways a pure political decision. You can talk about, is it value for money? Is it how is it going to work? What are the practicalities? The reality is you've got a political judgment that says we believe that this deterrent will work, and that therefore it will save money and it will introduce a balance against all the unfairness that we know people think comes with illegal migration. In that sense, the PAC is not the main event for this.
Miranda.
Well, it's very difficult though, isn't it? Because Sunak's pledge is stop the boats. And actually what we're seeing is that the small boat arrivals are up again. And then, so starting the flights is one thing, stopping the boats is another. And in some way I feel that all of the government's energy on this entire immigration issue has actually been directed to this one policy and the enormous amounts of money that you've just been discussing. And we, the deterrent case is unproven. If we declare Rwanda a safe country in this bill that's going through, where's the deterrent? It's apparently a safe country. It's crazy.
Well, the deterrent is obviously that people are trying to get to the UK and they won't end up there, right? That's the point of this. But I do think we've got a challenge with all of this stuff to say how can we prove that it is making the difference that it needs to in the timescale that inevitably is imposed on us by the electoral cycle.
Well, one thing that can be proven is that smoking is really, really bad for you. And it was one of Rishi Sunak's key promises, wasn't it, at the Tory party conference last year to phase out smoking, a ban that would mean no one under the age of 14 today would ever be allowed to buy cigarettes. And the vote, a free vote on this, is going to happen in the House of Commons this week. Katie, a free vote, so no whipping. But
no whipping for not every party. Labour is in favour of this bill.
Tories are not, which indicates that Number 10 are aware of a significant amount of opposition, unease about this on their own benches?
Yeah, I think the plan from its conception was to have a free vote, so partly because they knew it would be a divisive issue as opposed to announcing it and then realising a bit later down the line. So I think they always knew it was knotty for the Tory party. It's the second reading, so we're not yet at the point where MPs are having to decide if they back cigars versus cigarettes and so forth. We've got that joy to look forward to a bit further down the line. But I think it will be an interesting way to look at, there's rumour that 3 cabinet ministers might not vote with Rishi Sunak on this. You've had Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, describe the policy as absolutely mad. I think Liz Truss is tipped to speak in this debate, to speak against it. And actually, I think, although we're talking about one part of the party, there are some MPs in the middle who actually think it is a big health shift in terms of the type of health policy, because it is effectively stopping someone who is, born in a certain year from ever smoking, as opposed to having that limit, and therefore they think there's some questions of personal freedom. So I don't think it's just the libertarians who don't like it. Something it's a rush-through policy. Of course, in New Zealand, which is inspired by, they announced the policy, then a Conservative government came and they cancelled it. So we are now the only country really pursuing this. So I think when it comes to what's going to unite the Tory party this week, perhaps Rwanda, but certainly not Liz.
It does say something about Rishi Sunak's authority, doesn't it, Matt? That this key promise, which he obviously feels very passionately about, he can't tell his MPs, look, you're voting for this.
Well, it's a long-standing precedent that these sorts of votes have been free votes for the Tory Prime Minister to abide by that precedent. I think was fairly predictable from the start, as Katie says. I ask themselves every day they go to work, what can the government do to make the country better? And a lot of the time, the answer is the government should get on with their lives. There are some things that government can do, and things like some really good examples. Just
this would be look at a state in a gradual elimination of smoking to the good population and the NHS outlet, as Matt has said. The NHS is creeping. We really want to continue encouraging a habit that's so bad for individuals and so bad for in terms of health costs as well.
Do you in the years to come see the state getting far readier to put rules and restrictions in place for the sake of public health?
Well, that's a really interesting wide question, isn't it? I do think, as I said, that smoking is kind of in its own category, because the science is just so incredibly clear, and also because of the range of conditions which smoking is so bad for. It's not just lung cancer, it's circulatory health, heart health, a whole gamut.
Well, I voted to stop smoking indoors as an MP, and that's something that has made a big difference. And Labour's very keen to promote this. Not, we want to see this because it has, for all the reasons actually that Matt agreed. But it's extraordinary. A free vote is usually on a matter of conscience. This is because the Prime Minister can't get it through, because of Liz Truss and her allies, and it's a sign of a weak Prime Minister. But Labour's not going to stop it going through because it's for all the reasons Miranda said. It's catastrophic for health, and we need to keep going on this.
Well, we started the programme talking about Liz Truss, but she's not the only author hoping for bestseller success this week with a new book on the British economy. The journalist Will Hutton is best known for writing The State We're In the mid-1990s. Seen as a highly influential figure in New Labour circles, his book led the Daily Telegraph to dub him the most dangerous man in Britain. His new book's called This Time No Mistakes. I asked him why he decided to write it.
I think evidence of decay and decline is all around. In the city, the London Stock Exchange was number 3 in the world at the turn of the century. It's now number 10. Economically, there's the stagnation in wages and productivity, the collapse in investment, which is running at £100 billion a year below the average of our major competitors. Then there's British society. The distress in Britain. It's time for a reboot.
The subtitle of the book is How to Remake Britain, which does suggest a focus on the future, and yet much of your book looks back to what you see as mistakes of the past, and you're particularly critical, perhaps unsurprisingly, of Margaret Thatcher. Why is that?
I think the attempt by successive administrations in the spirit of Mrs. Thatcher to kind of let the market have its head, put the individual at the centre of the moral economic universe, has led to 4 unbelievable catastrophic errors. One, monetarism in the 1980s, eviscerating our industrial base. 2, financial deregulation, which led excessively to the great financial crash, worse in the UK than anywhere else in 2007-8. 3, really ill-considered kind of austerity. Lastly, Brexit, which was, again, get away from the shackles of the corpse of the European Union for a buccaneering free market future, and that's been a fiasco. And then capped by a kind of quintessential kind of bringing all the errors together, the Liz Truss 49 days and her libertarian crusade, which ended in such a kind of financial mayhem and a fiasco. And no country can take successive hits like that without reeling, and we're reeling.
You made your name in 1995, didn't you, when The State We're In was published, shortly before Tony Blair won and shortly after Britain crashed out of the ERM, and you argued in that market-orientated British capitalism was in trouble. But it has survived. It's a very difficult subject, isn't it, to make firm predictions about. How is your diagnosis of what is wrong with capitalism today different to what you thought was wrong then?
I'm much clearer about the need the public investment to crowd in private investment. And I think when I wrote along those lines, but not so clearly 25 years ago, there was a sense that was the wrong thing to do, and I couldn't persuade New Labour it was the right thing to do. Now I think Kit Starmer and Reeves lead into that view, and actually, importantly, so do many people in the business and financial world, and actually in the economic world. It's become, that's much more where people are at than they were economically, the absolutely pivotal thing. And actually, funnily enough, and I know this is, people are listening to this think, well, he's a Labour guy, but actually I am. But I did support levelling up. I thought Boris Johnson was right, and I thought he was right also in his commitment to net zero. And he was also right to really get kicking and screaming and a successive chance of the Exchequer to kind of really raise their sights to lift public investment, to crowd in private investment. That was not stupid. I say that's where it begins. It begins with really decisively and giving a lead by raising public investment in those areas, plus R&D. Then you crowd in private investment, and to crowd in private investment, you need a number of things. I mean, you need companies who are minded to go for it and are provided the wherewithal through loans and equity provided by a refashioned pension system, refashioned banking system, refashioned insurance system to do just that.
Do you feel that if Labour wins, Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves may end up being a lot more economically radical than their current rhetoric, mindful of the coming election, would suggest?
Yes, they can't help it. I mean, there hasn't been a 15-year period in British economic history since the Industrial Revolution where the purchasing power of what average people kind of made at work hasn't increased for 15 years, hence the intensity of the cost of living crisis. You know, you've got to get productivity up, you've got to get wages up, we've got to make the workplace fairer, we've got to equip people with the skills to raise productivity. If Labour get elected, I think that they will gain in confidence to do the things they have to do to be a successful government. The one thing that I give Mrs Thatcher, and I can see this in the book, is that actually she did burn with kind of moral conviction. I think that her putting the individual at the centre of everything was actually mistaken, but my God, it was done with moral conviction, and if you haven't got it, you know, you can be buttered about. And that's my biggest worry.
That's very interesting, yes. And so do you see that sort of moral drive or certainty with Sir Keir Starmer and his team? Do you detect a big idea there underpinning the current political rhetoric?
In private, a little bit more than you get in public, but it's still extraordinarily cautious. I mean, the Keir you get in public is more or less, you know, the one you get in private. Again, I mean,
what's your hesitancy?
I'm upbeat. The trouble is, I'm upbeat and tigerish by nature, you know, and I want to think the best of people rather than the worst. I do think that Keir Starmer, with his working class background, does get what it means to be on the wrong side of the tracks, be brought up kind of with modest circumstances, and he's broken out of that. And his siblings are still, you know, rooted in working class lives. He does get it. In all those senses, he does get the we. He does get the power of the collective. I mean, he's yet to put it together in a compelling way, in a compelling vision. You know, we'll see. I mean, we'll see in the weeks and months ahead whether Keir does pick some of this stuff up.
Will Hutton. Meg, Sir Keir Starmer yet to put an idea into a compelling vision. Do you share some of Will's analysis?
Well, I think, I mean, from his perspective, from the outside, perhaps that might be how it seems, but I know that there's a really intense work going on preparing for government, but it's being done carefully so that we are actually really working to cost everything to make sure it's deliverable. And look, I've spent over a decade on the Public Accounts Committee looking at failed delivery and how bad that is for the taxpayer, for our constituents, and for Britain. And we need to make sure that we're not in that realm, that we start off with a positive approach to actually deliver things. And it's much better to promise the electorate things we can actually deliver than go out with sort of rather sort of wishy-washy things. But yeah, we do need to campaign in poetry, as they say, and governing that will be something that the British public will then make a clear choice on.
Miranda.
Well, Will Hutton's intervention kind of speaks to this really key problem for Labour, doesn't it? Which is the balance between hope and despair. You know, Labour have got to convince people to come out and vote in the hope of hopey changey stuff. You know, the famous phrase about Obama. But you know, I mean, I read Meg's committee's report on all the underspending and underinvestment over the last decade or so, and where that necessitates enormous investment in the public realm almost immediately to stop things completely collapsing. And I had to read it sort of through my fingers. It's so horrifying. You know, Ken Clarke's given an interview to the FT tonight saying that Rachel Reeves' inheritance in terms of the economy is going to be the worst since the 1970s. It is really difficult for Labour, I think, this genuinely to sort of lay out a vision that kind of inspires, but also deals with the horrific, you know, mess that they're going to inherit. And even the
descriptions are obviously very different. There is some, I think, echo between even Liz Truss and Will Hutton on the problems that Britain faces in terms of stagnant economy, low productivity, the skills gap. I mean, the people on the left and right have a shared understanding of the depth of the problems, I think.
That's true.
Their solutions are very different.
Yeah, I think that is true, particularly on the need for economic growth and more productivity. And, you know, the upbeat bit of Will Hutton's thesis is that the business community finance really understands the need to get the country moving again. Let's hope he's right.
But
there's 14 years, let's be clear, of a Conservative government that's really contributed.
Matt.
Yeah, I think, the narrative of sort of that Labour wants to push of sort of 14 years of failure and all that is let's not forget.
Well, it's true.
Let's not forget that if the Labour governments of the past had been so incredibly successful, they wouldn't have lost the 2010 election, the 2015 election. Let's be honest about this stuff. I think what we do reasonably need to say, though, is there is some consensus on what Will Hutton said about big public sector investment crowding in private sector investment. And that's not because the private sector is suddenly going to be incredibly charitable. It's because there are real growth opportunities there for everyone. And I think that is a real potential success story. But I'm certainly having no truck with this idea that everything was paved with gold with the Gordon Brown left office.
Well, no. Well, I just have to say that I've looked on, and before you joined the committee, Matt, we've looked, for instance, at net zero. The stop-start approach to that has dissuaded the private sector from investing, and every year of delay is just going to cost more for both the public and private sector to get us across the line on something that's pretty critical to the planet.
Meg, Miranda mentioned the report you published just before Easter on the big nasties. Just quickly, don't frighten us too much. The terrible problems we've got coming up after the election.
Well, this is what plays to my theory of slow politics, that too often governments, actually of all colours, but particularly we've seen bad ones in the last 14 years, have left decisions and left it and not invested and left things slow. For example, we haven't decommissioned a single nuclear submarine since 1980. That's going to come to a critical point that's costing money to deliver. The 700,000 pupils in schools not fit for purpose. The 40 hospitals is actually only 32 in the programme, but 7 with RAC, which will reach the end of their useful life in 2030. These are critical spending points. Labour's pledged, of course, to put 2.5% of GDP into defence. And defence is a huge area where we've seen a lack of investment and real problems in delivery. So all of these are big problems that will hit the desk of the Chancellor and the Cabinet, of whichever party is elected.
The Tories obviously have a similar pledge on defence. I think both the Tories and Labour say, when spending allows, when the finances allow, which often does a lot of work.
And 2.5% when we can.
Exactly, and there's much of a choice.
Get any clearer before the election.
It isn't. On the other side, you had lots of Tories look at the spring budget, for example, and say that is a choice by Rishi Sunak to choose NI, not defence, and so forth. So I think it's a common thing we see. I do wonder on the Labour side, if we have a Labour government, will it be a stability premium, in the sense if there's a big majority, there's more certainty there? I think one thing you can say is the chopping and changing of the past few years in Tory leaders alone hasn't helped with the consistency of messaging.
I suppose also the point about the Labour defence spending pledge recently, if we have another fiscal event before an election and Jeremy Hunt seeks to follow up on his national insurance cuts with an income tax cut, Labour will presumably feel they have to also support that. All the time it's just making the figures look worse for Rachel Reeves, and she's now having to hunt around for new sources of revenue.
Katie, the papers, you've been going through the front pages.
Yeah, there is just one story.
We were reading about on Monday.
Ultimately one story in Times tonight, which is Israel and Iran. So 3 different main angles. One is just Israel vows revenge as the world calls calm. That's on the front of the Times. Financial Times, Israel weighs options after Iran attack. And then I think it's moving to the Mirror saying, step back from the brink, and this is a warning to the G7 to Iran, but also Biden telling Israel to think carefully. And Iran risks an uncontrollable wide of war if Israel attacks, G7 nations warn, and that's on the front of the Eye.
And one small story on the front page of the Times, Britain may try to send migrants to Costa Rica. Did you know about this?
No, we did not. We know they've been looking for lots of other options, and the whole plan really was we'd get Rwanda going, and then other countries would sign up, because there obviously is a finite number of places. But yes, it's ultimately looking at Armenia, Ivory Coast, Costa Rica and Botswana according to leaked documents, but nothing signed on the dotted line.
Sounds like a job for the PAC.
I think it could be. Well, we will see if this week does indeed wrap up the parliamentary saga with the Rwanda bill, and whether planes take off at some point before the summer. But for now, thank you very much indeed, all of you, for being here this evening. Meg Hillier, Matt Warman, Katie Balls and Miranda Green. And thank you very much for listening. We will be back at the same time next week, but for now, from all of us here at the Westminster Hour, have a very good night.
Thank you, Ben. The editor of the Westminster Hour was Harriet Oliver, the producer Patrick Cowley, and the studio manager Chris Ablaqua. Ancient Greek comedy awaits this after the news as Melvyn Bragg and his guests discuss Aristophanes' life districtor. That's one good reason to stick with us here at Radio 4, and here's another.
It's become so ubiquitous that we hardly give it a thought.
It helped our ancestors invent new and better tools, and today it can be used to heal us.
It's really great for the scalp because that's a difficult place to stitch up.
This is the past, present and future of adhesive. The ideal would be that you had a complete off-on glue. 1 minute it was absolutely stuck hard, and then you did one specific thing to it and it came apart. Glued Up, the sticky story of humanity. With me, Mark Meadovnik, on Radio 4 and BBC Sound. This Monday to Friday lunchtime at 1:45.
BBC News at 11 o'clock. World leaders have been calling for restraint after Iran launched more than 300 missiles and drones at Israel overnight. Israel says 99% of them were shot down. The attack was in response to an Israeli strike from the Iranian consulate in Syria. Iran says as far as it is concerned, the operation is now over. Israel says it will act surprised when the time is right. The UN Security Council is conducting an emergency session in New York to discuss the matter. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said it was time to defuse and de-escalate.
It's time to step back from the brink. It's vital to avoid any action that could lead to major military confrontations on multiple fronts in the Middle East. Civilians are already bearing the brunt and paying the highest price.
Rishi Sunak has confirmed RAF jets were involved in helping Israel fend off the Iranian attack. He said this intervention saved lives in Israel. He's also called for calm heads to prevail. A vigil has been held for the 6 people who were killed in a knife attack at a shopping centre in Sydney yesterday. Police have identified the attacker as 40-year-old Joel Couchy, who was shot dead by an officer at the scene. Survivors of the Manchester Arena bombing are taking legal action against the intelligence service MI5. 22 people died in the blast in 2017. A subsequent inquiry concluded the attack might have been prevented if intelligence had been properly shared. The Home Office says 214 people were intercepted crossing the Channel on migrant boats yesterday. The number of such journeys is up nearly a fifth so far this year, compared with the same period in 2023. The Olivier Theatre Awards have taken place in London this evening. Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical Sunset Boulevard was one of the big winners. It picked up 7 awards, including Best Actress in a Musical for Nicole Scherzinger. Elsewhere, Dame Arlene Phillips won an Olivier for her choreography on the musical Guys and Dolls. BBC News.
In 1974, ABBA stunned Europe with this absolute classic. 50 years on, Radio 2 celebrates the Swedish supergroup with eras ABBA.
So many ABBA songs are pure perfection.
There's some beautiful, really heartfelt ballads, which I love.
From the music and the fashion to the fallouts and the triumphs, join us for the ultimate celebration of one of the world's biggest bands.
Eras ABBA. To listen, search ABBA on BBC Sounds.
What's not to like? Now on BBC Radio 4, here's Melvyn Bragg with In Our Time.
Hello, in 411 BC, Athenians watched Aristophanes' new comedy, Lysistrata, for their first and only time. It was unforgettable. He showed the women of Athens and Sparta so wanting peace in their long war with each other that they seized the treasure on the Acropolis that would fund the fighting, and they declare a sex strike and they win. It was all fantastical enough to be palatable to the audience, but it asked the challenging question, what are we fighting for? And if patriarchal Athenians didn't want to give ground to women, wasn't it time for the deaths of so many men to stop? With me to discuss Aristophanes' Lysistrata are Sarah Miles, Associate Professor in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University, James Robson, Professor of Classical Studies at the Open University, and Paul Cartledge, A.G. Lemantis Senior Research Fellow of Clare College, University of Cambridge. Paul Cartledge, who was Aristophanes and what did he write?
He was a poet. Poietes means a maker. He was an Athenian. probably quite upper class. He's the son of Philippos, which means lover of horses, which probably suggests he comes from a horsey background. And he was born somewhere around the middle of the 5th century BC, so we're in the 440s. About a generation after the major clash and conflict which had involved many Greeks in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, when they were invaded by Persians, and a number of plays by Aristophanes refer back to. And one of the reasons for that was as a result of that conflict, two great cities, Greek cities, emerged, one of which was Athens, and that was the Athens into which Aristophanes was born. Quite an extraordinary era, a bit like Florence, around about 1500. So he felt that his genius ran not in the tragic vein, but in the comic vein, and he actually had a lot of fun doing para-tragedy. So we know that he wrote something like, and had performed something like 40 plus plays, but of those 40 plus, only 11 survived. And the one we're looking at is number 7 in terms of survival, the Lysistrata. We're not absolutely sure which of the two play festivals of 411 BC it was performed at, but he had a very long career after that. He died, we think, somewhere around 385, and there are 4 more plays by him surviving after the Lysistrata.
What was going on between Athens and Sparta at that time, and what had the Athenians endured?
Athens between 480 and 330. They were 2 years out of 3 actually fighting someone else, not just non-Greeks, but other Greeks. The most famous, the most disastrous of those conflicts was what we call the Peloponnesian War, or the Atheno-Peloponnesian War. This broke out when Aristophanes was about 15, went on and off for 27 years, and it was after the resumption. This is slightly controversial. Some historians, ancient and modern, say it was just one war. Others say it was 2 wars separated by a period of peace. But what we're dealing with, unambiguously, a period of war, and Athens are doing exceptionally badly. They rather stupidly overreached themselves in 415, having made a kind of peace with Sparta, and Aristophanes wrote a play, Peace, to mark that juncture. Having done that, they then fell out again, and the Athenians got too big for their boots. And one of their adventures, it was not just adventure, was to try to conquer not just one city in Sicily, but the whole of Sicily. Disaster. Thousands of Athenians died, and that's just 2 years before the Lysistrata. So that would have been very much in the minds of ordinary Athenians that their brothers, their uncles, their other male relatives, many of them dead.
Thank you. Sarah Morris, we're talking with Aristophanes, he writes in the comedy genre. They write in comedy or tragedy, they don't mix them up. What might the audience have expected when they went along to this one?
Well, as a comedy performance, it comes as part of the festival context. But this festival was not just a turn up and celebrate occasion, it was one where we had competition. So Aristophanes was one of many comic poets, 3 we think in each year, competing against each other for the top prize to be seen as the best comedian of the year. What was the prize? The prize? That's a good question. But it was, most importantly, popularity, fame, and potentially the ability to put on more plays. And I say that because Aristophanes had his first play trial in 427, and his plays were put on through the decades, throughout the Peloponnesian War and beyond. And that's the joy of the 40 plays we have on it. You know, often the plays that we have, they cover 20s, 40s, 100s, pretty multi-to-80. So we get a sense of some of these examples of times like Aristophanes. The other thing that festival context that Aristophanes is competing in is there are also performances of tragedians in the theatre. So we have the great tragedian Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. During Aristophanes' lifetime, Sophocles and Euripides are the only tragedians around. Aeschylus has already died. So this is a festival context in which you're going to come and see tragedies that will rend your heart, fill you with emotion, bring you to what Aristotle called a point of catharsis, a kind of ritual purging, with stories such as Oedipus, Tyrannus, the Bacchae, all kinds of horrifying and wonderful journeys into the depths of what it is to be human. And then after that, you get the work of comedy of Aristophanes.
And that is such a dreadful place to be, because Aristophanes, all of his comedies are set in the contemporary world. They are part of Athenian life, and they are very much drawing on the world around it. You can see Aristotelic comedy as quite a parasite on society, on politics, on the people around it, in order to create a comedy that the audience are there to see.
Can you tell the listeners something about the setting of that play?
By the setting, you mean the environment that they're in. The theatre of Dionysus itself. So we're on the southeast slope of the Acropolis, so at the heart of Athens, at the heart of the democracy itself, right under the Parthenon, in the temple of Athena, which of course will be connected to the phrase like the character itself. And in that theatre of Dionysus, around 10,000, Aristophanes' Frog, a different play, says that there were about 10,000 people in the audience. So we're looking at a huge open-air outdoor performance. Not as big as Glastonbury, although I think I looked up that in 1971, when David Bowie performed, there were about 10,000 people present. So that's the kind of scale that you're looking at. And the thing is, you're sitting in an outdoor environment. There's no fourth wall between audience and actors. Every performance of comedy had a chorus of 24 Athenian citizens, and they would all have been male citizens who performed the dancing, the singing, the musical aspect of Aristophanes comedy.
Was everybody in the play male?
Everyone in the play was male. So
was everybody in the audience male?
That is the biggest debated question that we know, but what we can say for sure is there are definitely a male-dominant audience. There are, for example, in Aristophanes' Birds, there is reference to the idea that you can nip home and have sex with someone you're not supposed to because everyone else will be in the theatre. So that's taken as proof that women are at home, but also that doesn't have to mean that all women were at home. So it's a debated thing, but they're not going to be the dominant part of the audience.
But they're going to be fairly strong in the play itself.
So Aristophanes' Lysistrata has an all-female set of protagonists, Lysistrata and the other women who call the sex strike, and they sort of fill the stage from the beginning. And then we meet a chorus that is half female and half male, which represents our conflict in the play.
Thank you. James Robson, could you outline the plot in more detail than I did?
Sure. You've alluded to some of the major parts of the plot already. So this is famous for being the play about the sex strike. As Sarah said, it takes place in contemporary Athens, and so the contemporary Athens to the Athenian audience in 411 BCE. And it takes place against the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War as well. So at the beginning of the play, Lysistrata calls women together from all over, which we eventually discover is this proposition of a sex strike. Following the women's reluctant agreement to the sex strike, we actually discover there's a second strand to her plot, and the next chunk of the play is this. So it's the older women's seizure and occupation of the Acropolis. The men turn up, as Sarah says, half of the chorus are old men, the other half are old women. The men turn up to try and oust the women from the Acropolis. They're unsuccessful, and this gives Lysistrata the opportunity to explain why they've seized the Acropolis and why they want to put an end to the war. She lands some pretty good punches during her exposition, but essentially she doesn't win the battle of hearts and minds.
What were essential punches?
She talks about the poignancy, some of the difficulties that women face being left behind. She talks about some really quite dark things, like the death of women's sons who've been sent out as hoplites, who've been sent out as soldiers. She talks about the disruption to the oikos, to the household as well, that men's absence brings.
It seems to be she goes out one day and summons all the women of Athens and any others around to join her, and they do. Is there any sense in the text or after the text that this might be a bit of a difficult command?
Oh, absolutely. The whole plot is completely logically impossible from beginning to end. I think if Aristophanes has a particular genius in Lysistrata, is that he moves the focus from scene to scene, from thought to thought so rapidly that you don't see all of the plot flaws. But of course they're myriad, and
such as?
Well, the idea that she could get messages to women across Greece, the idea that it all conveniently arrive in the right order at the same time, the idea, the whole idea behind the sex strike as well is that men are deprived of having sex with their wives, and therefore they get these permanent swollen erections after 6 days. But right at the beginning of the play, we've already heard that the men have been absent from their homes, sometimes for months on end, and also the men seem not to have realised that masturbation is something which they could use to cure their swollen erections either. So that's just a hint of some of the
there's also female
elements.
slaves and prostitutes, and there's homosexuals, so there's plenty of stuff about.
Absolutely, yeah. And so prostitution isn't really alluded to. Athens had a very active prostitution industry in the classical era, but of course they're not really mentioned. There is this figure of reconciliation who is brought on towards the end of the play, who seems to be a prostitute figure, but prostitutes aren't mentioned, same-sex sex isn't mentioned as an outlet, and so in order for the sex strike plot to be effective, you have to regard the only type of sex that you can have is sex within marriage.
And it's emphasised by the fact that the men who play men walk around with an enormous leather phallus dangling in front of them, and sometimes with wood in it, so it's erect in front of them.
Yeah, this is a bit of comic genius on Aristophanes' part as well. So, part of the traditional garb of a comic actor, you'd have padding, body padding, so a big stomach, you'd have a padded chest, you'd have a padded rump as well, but you'd traditionally have this dangling leather phallus. Now, Aristophanes just has this genius idea of turning them up the other way, and you don't know that an Athenian audience has ever seen this before. So it's this really amazing comic idea when Dionysius is the first man who comes on about halfway through the play with this giant erection, and then we get other male characters joining him as well.
Oh, I'm just going to add, we don't know, do we, whether it won the prize or not?
Also.
No.
I was coming to you, Paul. Can you tell listeners what you know about the success or not of the sex strike?
In terms of the play?
In terms of the play.
Well, at the end, it's crucial. But what I think, now this is a bit of a historical take, and this is a very interesting suggestion I've read, which is that why did Aristophanes choose to write a woman like that? Well, one of the reasons may be what James said. Lots of women were really distressed. They were widowed and their sons had just been killed. But women on top, women in charge is a revolution. It's a complete world turned upside down. So why would Aristophanes think there's a cure for the ghastly situation that Athens is in that would be funny is a case of women occupying the Acropolis. Now,
the sacred Acropolis, which is where all the treasure is.
Yeah, now there are two reasons in my humble opinion. One is that is where the war chest of the Athenian state physically was held in the Parthenon. Now we might think the Parthenon, it's a temple, it must therefore be religious, can't have anything to do with mammon. Au contraire, the Athenians saw no disjunction. And secondly, the priestess, the highest priestess of the entire Athenian state, she was actually the priestess of Athena of the city, not of Athena the Virgin, but there was no separate altar between those two. So in effect, the worship of Athena of the city and the worship of the Athena the Virgin sort of melded together. Anyway, her name happened to be, didn't just happen to be, of course, Lysimachie. And that, I think, is a pun. Aristophanes is very keen on puns, paronomasia. And this one literally puns on the name of the chief priestess of the Athenian state, who might have been sitting right in the middle and next to the orchestra. We're not absolutely sure. So, anyway, the point of this is, even if the husbands are so horny that they finally wish to make peace, if they still have access to the silver on the Acropolis in the Parthenon, they can still carry on fighting in principle. So the Athenian women, they as it were double down with the Spartan women, with the Boeotian woman and the Corinthian woman, and they say, no, you won't lay your hands, you can't afford to fight. And the twofold plot, which, as James says, is not consequential in a logical sense, nevertheless is belt and braces.
I want to come in on that, because you mentioned Lysimachie, the name of this priestess, and of course our main character is Lysistrata. And Lysimachie in Greek means someone who dissolves battle. And Lysistrata is a name that means someone who dissolves the armies. And what's so interesting, Aristophanes loves to play around with names and puns. And at the very opening of Lysistrata, when she comes on stage, Lysistrata speaks to herself, wondering, how am I going to get these women together? Where are they? They're late. So she's sort of grumpy about that. And then she says, oh, I see my Athenian colleague, my Athenian fellow citizen coming, and her name is Kalonike. And Kalonike means beauty in victory, or beauty and victory. So the first opening moment where these characters meet on stage, we have one saying, greetings, Kalonike, beautiful victory, and the other one says, hi there, dissolver of armies. So it's like the opening, before we got to the fifth line of the play, we've already had the whole thing set up. These are two characters who are here to make peace. And that's kind of a really neat way that Aristophanes encapsulates the kind of themes that are coming before we've even got there.
Sounds very skillful playwright, doesn't he?
Yes, a great man with words, but also the physicality and the visual side of the comedy is much his kind of prerogative. So if I come back to the idea of sitting in the theatre of Dionysus looking down on this movement of choruses, so through the first part of the play, you start with one woman on stage, Lysistrata, then Kalonike appears, and then Myrine, we've got the Corinthian and Grecian and Spartan, Lampeter, they all come on stage, and then we have this sort of gathering of women, so suddenly the stage is populated by women. And then as we move on in the play, you have this split chorus of women and men, and notably also old women and men. I think not enough is made of the fact that our chorus of comedy is older women and older men. It's not just men and women. And if you're sitting in the theatre of Dionysus, you're watching this chorus, who throughout the first half of the play are at loggerheads, are physically fighting each other. And then by the end of the play, they come to resolution and come together. So Aristophanes' skills there are that you watch that battle and then that coming together, which by the time we get to the end of the play with reconciliation, the chorus is one again.
Thank you. James Robson. There are a lot of jokes, a lot of bawdiness. It's about as bad as it gets, really. I mean, they always took it for granted that there was going to be swearing, there was going to be this, there was going to be that, there was going to be other.
Absolutely. So obscenity is a really central part of the old comic tradition. So old comedy is the genre in which Aristophanes is writing. I think if you went to see an old comic play and you didn't hear obscene language, so direct references to the sexual and scatological realm, you'd be pretty disappointed. As a whole, I would say that Athenians are relatively prudish, in fact. So where you find obscenity used is normally in rituals connected with Demeter or with Dionysus, as is the case with theatre. So this is a sort of sacred festival space where you're allowed to put aside the normal conventions of everyday life. I think within that, though, it's not just the case that Aristophanes is entertaining us, throwing lots of obscenities at us. It is used for comic effect, to be sure, but he also does some really interesting and subtle things with obscenity in the play. So he's the master of this. For example, when Lysistrata proposes the sex strike, we've had a lot of indication in the prologue that something sexy is going to be proposed, but we don't know exactly what it was, what it's going to be. And she says, what you need to abstain from, women, is topeos. So she uses direct reference to the male member here, and so this has a shock value for us as in the audience because we haven't heard an obscenity yet, but it also has a shock value for the women. And of course, topeos, cock, is the last thing that the women do want to abstain from, because women stereotypically in comedy are sex mad as well as mad on booze. There are other ways in which she uses obscenity too. There's a really subtle piece of characterization which I really love. So when the old women are facing off the magistrate at the Acropolis, the magistrate brings one of his archers in and asks them to seize Lysistrata, and one of the women steps forward and says, if you lay so much as a finger on her, you're going to crap all over the place. And she uses this obscenity, kHz. Now, one of the unwritten rules of comedy is that women do not use obscenities in front of men. So this really beautifully shows how the women are being transgressive at this point in time. The other advantage, I think, of holding off from using too much obscenity is then Aristophanes is able to use it in the latter half of the play to really devastating effect as well. So in the latter half of the play, this is how the men express their sexual frustration. So we're under no doubt whatsoever as to what Dionysius wants to do to his wife and where she would like him to be. Also, when the Spartan ambassador and the Athenian ambassador at the end of the play are both ogling this character of reconciliation, this beautiful young woman. Lysistrata is giving them a lecture about how they should all live as one happy family and be at peace, and the only things that they interject are comments about reconciliation's body, and very direct comments at that. So again, this is a beautiful way that he shows the men's sexual frustration. At the end of the play, when peace is made and everyone's happy, all the obscenity melts away as well. So obscenity is very much in that world of hostility and war.
Let's talk about money. Cicero said that money is the sinews of war. And so they go for the sinews. Yeah. And they get the money, this massive, massive treasure. So it wasn't just a sex strike, it was we grab the money that belongs to Athens.
Right,
Can you develop that?
Yeah, let me be a little more specific. Right at the beginning of the war, and I think this is 20 years ago, which is a lifetime for many people, a generation. The Athenian assembly, having decided to go to war to resist, as they saw it, the Spartan attack on them. The Spartans, of course, said the Athenians were starting it, so both of them claimed to be not responsible for the outbreak of the war. The Athenian assembly set aside a huge sum of money, 1,000 talents of silver, which is the equivalent of the entire revenue of the Athenian state from both internal and external sources. And that was not to be touched until and unless the Athenians were absolutely on their uppers, that they would, wanting to continue to fight, be unable to fight unless they released this 1,000 talents. Well now, who looked after that physically, 1,000 talents? It was in the Parthenon. But the priestess who actually was responsible for it to the Athenian state was this, we've had Lysimache, who, by the way, was high priestess for 64 years, a later source tells us. So there's a very direct relationship between the decision of the Athenians in 412, which is the year before the Lysistratas performed. So when Aristophanes is thinking about writing it, the decision to release, to touch that iron reserve, which was then turned both into silver coinage to pay sailors and other soldiers, but also to strike a very, very rare gold coinage. I mean, everything is, as it were, up the spout. It's all going wrong in 412, 411 when this play is put on. And then not very long after this play, there is a genuine coup, I mean an anti-democratic coup, a really nasty one. And so Aristophanes may or may not have had his finger on the pulse. You know, he might have sensed in the wind, and certainly there were extreme right-wingers who'd been dying for the Athenian democracy to be ended because they saw it as inimical to them. But there is one very specific relevance of all that, which I'm coming to, which is among the emergency measures, as well as allowing themselves to touch the iron reserve, they appointed a special council, which is very, very oligarchic thing to do, not a democratic thing. 10 men, including the poet Sophocles. We only know the names of 2 of them. And one character in the Lysistrata, as my comrades well know, is a representative of that body. He's called the probulos, sometimes translated magistrate, but literally it's a fore-deliberator, a pre-councillor. Very Spartan, so Athens is in turmoil anyway, the real Athens, when this play is conceived and then put on.
Sarah, was he taking a risk, Aristophanes, on making fun of all this, putting a parallel fictional world beside what was going on, as Paul's been describing?
It's a really interesting question, and particularly because Aristophanes loved to name-check people. He would satirize and name politicians who might be sitting in the audience, he'd have tragedians, actors, you name it, poets, anybody who was around. And yet Lysistrata, and indeed we have 2 plays of Aristophanes from 411, Lysistrata, and the other one is called Thesmophoria Zeusai, but I'll call it Thesmo for shorter.
It takes half a page.
Exactly. Lysistrata and Thesmo are 2 of the plays that have the least number of named individuals who are satirized.
Why is that?
And that potentially relates to what Paul was saying, that Athens is in a right mess internally. They are on the verge of having an internal revolution, which is what happens in the months following the performances of Lysistrata and Thesmo. So within 411, Athens will implode. Temporarily, the democracy is overthrown. This proboulos that Paul referred to will, in a sense, take charge. And then Athens rights itself again quite quickly and goes back to democracy. So it's so interesting that when we look at Lysistrata, there's a lack of these named individuals. There's no huge attacks on Aristophanes' contemporary figures, particularly political ones. So Cleon, who by this time was deceased, but Cleon was the nemesis of Aristophanes. Back to his earliest plays, Cleon was a demagogue, someone who spoke for the people in that sense, also he claimed. And Aristophanes loved to rip anything he could out of Cleon and tear him to shreds. He cast him as a slave, a Paphlagon slave, in a play called Knights, where he's slave to the people. Demos, who is his master, quite literally. In Aristophanes' Wasps, Cleon is presented as a downright dog who is on trial and is prosecuting another dog for stealing Sicilian cheese. So he can really go for people by name. He can extensively satirize them. 411, none of it. And yet, the general themes, that idea of, hey Athens, let's come to a point of peace, is a massive thing to be doing, because we're at 411, we're 20 years thereabouts into the Peloponnesian War, if you think of it as starting in 431. Maybe some Athenians have had enough, and yet others will want to continue to make sure that Athens and democracy are not jeopardized in some way, which might happen with Sparta.
Can I come to you, James, to sort of develop that? It seems to be Aristophanes is working on two levels. He's quite conservative and is very subversive.
Absolutely. So, as Sarah has been outlining, old comedy has subversion at its very heart, and that's writ large in the plays that we have of Aristophanes from the 420s, from his early career. And I think we have subversiveness going on in this play as well. As Sarah has outlined, what's avoided are direct attacks on politicians. We get a few name checks in passing, rather we get criticisms of the democracy as a whole, or of the kind of political decision making that goes on. And Lysistrata is particularly keen on criticising the kind of decision making that goes on in the assembly. Where I think the play could be said to be subversive is very much in the tradition of old comedy too, which is that you seize a theme which perhaps a social issue which the audience might feel a little uncomfortable about. And I think gender is potentially one of those issues at this moment in time. So we've had this disastrous war going on for 20 years, but we've also had the Sicilian expedition end in complete and utter disaster in 413. Yeah, so the Athenians lost thousands upon thousands of men in Sicily. So that must have skewed the demography in Athens considerably, especially when you take into account that men are away from their homes as well. We know from later sources that women at this point may have been doing jobs and tasks that they wouldn't have done beforehand. So middle-class women actually having to go out and work, for example. Presumably women were effectively in charge of households, perhaps in a way that they hadn't been before as well. And presumably too, there were women in the city who really had nothing more to lose at this point if they'd lost husbands and sons in the war. So I think what is happening is that women are being seen in public more, they've got more of a public voice, perhaps even some of them have made themselves quite difficult. And so Aristophanes in this play is really sticking the needle in a bit and saying, what if this got even worse? What if women actually took over? And so I think he's winding his audience up to a certain extent there. But the counterbalance of that is that the vision that the women are working towards is extraordinarily conservative. So at the end of the play, the idea of bringing your husband home is that he can once again take charge of the household. You will be there as a provider of care for him and his children. You will do the domestic chores, and those were evoked a lot during the play, this idea of weaving, for example, which is a constant theme throughout the play. And you'll also have that sexual relationship with your husband as well. So the vision that ultimately the play projects is very much back to the past, back to the traditional ways of doing things.
Paul, which of Aristophanes' targets hit home most tellingly?
In the Lysistrata in general, because it's full of all sorts of barbs. Well, peace is the one. He wrote 3 surviving peace plays. He wrote 3 women plays, and the Lysistrata is one where the two come together. So depending on whether you think, as James has suggested, he was conservative, then he might have been anxious just about the possibility of women being a little too forward and actually demanding some sort of say in ways that they were typically forbidden to have unless they happen to be the chief priestess of the Athenian state. Or there is another priestesshood which was a more democratic one. The Athena of the city priestesshood is an aristocratic one, so it's by heredity, by birth, whereas the other one in favour of victory, Athena of victory, the priestesses were chosen by lot, and one of them happens to be called Myrine, which is the name given, as Sarah started off by saying, to one of the other two women characters, Athenian women characters in Lysistrata. So I think some people have on the one hand detected a certain feminism in Aristophanes, meaning a sort of suggestion, look, Lysistrata's pretty competent. Yes, okay, the women, other than that, they're stereotypically sex-mad and drunkards, but if there were more women like Lysistrata, would we be able to continue to say all Athenian women are stupid and drunken and sex-mad and so on? And then what are the targets? Well, in a way, democracy, because there is a very strong, it's typically an oligarchic standpoint, though already some people were putting it forward back in the 420s. You know, the democracy, it's not a bad idea, that is in terms of equality and freedom, but boy, does it make mistakes. And when it makes mistakes, they're dreadful mistakes, whereas you can see well, for example, going to Sicily is the most obvious one. So he's targeting those ordinary Athenians who think the war is a good thing as such, and that it's fairly easily winnable. No, it isn't. And it's going to mean all sorts of changes bound to come about if you're a little too rash.
Thank you. Sarah, can you pick out a point where we get a clear idea of Aristophanes' skills as a playwright?
Well, I mentioned to his use of the names at the beginning of the play, and he is very much a wordsmith. One thing that he does supremely well is invent words. And we know that if you think of Aristophanes' play Birds, the word cloud cuckoo land, cloud cuckoo bill, that we still use in English, comes from Aristophanes' play, which is the city that was created in the clouds in Aristophanes' Birds. In Lysistrata, he has a lovely go at creating whole lines that are single words. So when the probulos, the magistrate, is there and he's trying to arrest Lysistrata, and we've got physical violence and action going on stage, Lysistrata cries out to her comrades. She calls them, oh, xumakoi, gunaikes, oh my ally women. And then Lysistrata addresses them, and they're these long compound words that fill whole lines. And one of them goes, O spermagoraio lekitholakano alpolides, which means seed of the agora, soup seller, vegetable seller women. And that's one of these sort of noble calling upon someone title. It has a rhythm that's something quite solemn. And then she follows up with another one, and she says, O scordo pando putria popolides. So all of those are one-line words, and that one means, oh, garlicky, landlady, bread seller, women. So at that moment of crisis and battle, she calls on these characters, uses longwave and these names, and they're completely made up. They're just comic titles, and they may not make us laugh, but they would appeal to the Athenians because there's that sense that this is like a battle that's about to begin. And I suppose one thing that's not been mentioned is there's one very important battle between men and women mythically that took place in Athens, and that is between the Amazons and the Venus.
That two things really. One is the visual humour, which I just think has so much potential in Lysistrata. It's really interesting seeing modern productions of the play because you realise just how much room there is for visual humour. So the battle of the old men with the old women at the beginning, for example, and the men mishandle their logs and their smoke, for example. They get smoke in their eyes, they get doused with water, which is within the mind of twice more in the text as well. So clearly this is meant to be a comic highlight of the play. We've already talked about the comic phalluses as well, and men later on in the play are holding their cloaks away from their midriffs because they don't want to show that they have these swollen erections, for example. So there's lots of great visual humour there. And the other point I was going to make was about double entendres. So yes, we do get these direct references to the scatological and sexual realm, these obscenities throughout the play, but we also get really rich double entendres. there are sort of too many to mention in a way, but towards the end of the play, for example, the chorus are making fun of the Spartan delegates, saying, oh, things have really hardened badly in Sparta, and the Spartan says, oh yes, my comrades are looking for a thrust-up country, and so there are myriad of jokes like that in the play as well. So there's great double entendres and great filthy jokes.
And just to come in on that, the double entendres are also visual. So in that sense, when you have the women holding the Acropolis and keeping the gates shut, and the men are attacking with their logs, I mean, that's a very phallic image in itself, and they're trying to break down the Acropolis door to get in, and the women will not let them in. So the visual metaphors, the kind of sexual play, is all the way there while you're watching the play happening, and it's only at the end when we get sort of resolution and reconciliation that sexually as well men and women come together again. So it's played out as a visual joke as well as the verbal one that James refers to.
We're near the end now. Paul, the action towards the end moves towards a peaceful settlement. Yeah. Could you tell... I thought what's been going on. This might be a surprise to some of the audience. Anyway, could you tell people how it did move towards a peaceful settlement and what that peaceful settlement entails?
Well, just to say that it's not necessarily peaceful between men and women in Athens or anywhere else in Greece, but it is between Sparta and its allies and Athens and its allies. This is the key. Well, they had made a truce before, just about when Aristophanes was born, actually, 445. So it's not unexampled. They made a second one in 421, which is only 10 years before. So the very fact of making a real piece isn't odd in itself. It's how this particular piece is brought about through sexual incontinence and through occupying the Acropolis, which is, of course, very exceptional. But the point of the ending, I think, is this is Aristophanes possibly at his best in some way, is that it's very lyrical, and it is religious, and it's hymnal. And so it ends on prayers to many, many gods, not just Athena, or because, ironically, in a way, the chief god of the Spartans was also an Athena of the city, so the two of them had the same Athena as their chief god. And the concluding verses are indeed a hymn to mainly the Spartan, as opposed to the Athenian goddess, and there's reference to the Eurotas, the banks of the Eurotas which flowed through ancient Sparta, and the whole thing ends as all his, I think I'm okay in saying all his peace plays end with happy, joyous, religious, ritual resolution.
Sarah, what are if you were to perform this today, put it on today, what are the challenges?
They are many. I think James referred earlier to that level of obscenity that I know many people who've put on plays have talked about having to turn it down. So we go to some of the earliest recorded versions of Lysistrata, so back to the early 20th century. Performance of the play was used as part of the push to sort of graphic humour just to make it palatable, but that continues through in sort of many contemporary productions. So yeah, turning down the graphic humour. And indeed, of course, we mentioned earlier that all the parts were played by men originally. So both the men and the women in the play, in Aristophanes' play, would have been male-only performers. And that isn't the way most plays go now, and it changes the dynamic completely in terms of when you're thinking of contemporary debates around gender, feminism, etc. So we have productions done by many playwrights in the UK. So Peter Hall did production, Germaine Greer wrote a version, Blake Morrison. So we have all these different productions that are having to grapple with those kinds of themes. But in that sense, then, I think that's the joy and the power of Aristophanes, is the fact of possibilities, and that things get changed and twisted and adapted away from Aristophanes, so that it doesn't have to be a majority of jokes about
gender, but there's a whole history in the 20th century's English-speaking world of the play being used to push the boundaries of acceptability, about dialogue about sex, about protest, about pacifism, about feminism too. I think it's an awkward play today in many ways, however. It's noticeable that I certainly haven't seen any productions in the last few years. And so I think perhaps post-Me Too, I think post the way that we regard gender now, not as a binary opposition, but something as more complex, the play ends up being a lot more complicated, because the idea that women stay at home and the men go out and fight, and that it's women pitched against men in that way is challenging. And also the way in which the play conceptualizes war as well, I think doesn't quite chime with the way that modern conflicts are fought. I think it's an amazing play to use for students, and I do think it has the status of a classic. I would say that Lysistrata has probably been staged not just more than any other Aristophanes play in the English-speaking world, but probably more than all the rest of them put together. So I do think it's an absolute giant of the comic canon, and we have relatively few of those giants compared with, say, tragedy.
Last word, Paul.
There is an element in the original which is very serious, and that's part of the humour, I think. But this title character, she is an Athenian woman, she's not anything grand, but on the other hand, she's smart, and she uses words brilliantly, and that would have given the audience pause, I think.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks to Paul Carlisle, Sarah Miles, and James Robson, and to our studio engineer, Steve Greenwood. Next week, it's Napoleon's 100 Days, his escape from Elba, March to Paris, and defeat at Waterloo. Thanks for listening.
In Our Time with Melvyn Bragg was produced by Simon Tillotson. It was a BBC Audio Studios production for Radio 4.
I'm Helen Lewis, and I have a question for you. What connects nightmarish neighbourhood group chats, Russian propaganda, and a woman who married a chatbot? Well, they're all stories that demonstrate just how much instant messaging has changed the world. It has transformed how we date, how we vote, how we argue, and how we fight wars. So join me as I journey deep inside our phones and computers to uncover stories as big as the invasion of Ukraine and as intimate as falling in love over text. Helen Lewis has left the chat. Continues on Wednesday mornings at 9:30 on Radio 4 and BBC Sound.
Now on Radio 4, Short Works, a new story from the award-winning author Naomi Wood. In When Love Sucks, a woman turns to an AI dating coach to mend her broken heart.
When Love Sucks, by Naomi Wood. Read by Rose Robinson. My dating coach is a chatbot, who, though technically nameless, I call Betty. Betty says I need to get back in the game. I tell her at this point I'm so lonely I'd shack up with anyone. I tell her I need someone to want me again, now that he doesn't. I tell her that inside me swims a pufferfish, just slowly dying, leaking its toxins into every last limb. The pufferfish, as metaphor, is beyond poor Betty's scope. She tells me this Weltschmerz, not her word, is normal. I know this, that being dumped sucks harder than actual death and actual grief, because of the deep drill into all the unexplored reasons that I am totally unlovable and undesirable, and that I am a person both full of terrible need, but also perfectly suited to rejection, then replacement, etc. Betty says it's good I'm suffering, because that's what 75% of the world is made of. Like how our planet is more tears than land. And therefore, by being like the world, I am more fully in the world. Then she texts me a verse of Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 to 6, which I don't know what to do with, because I have no Bible, but also because my curiosity in things flatlined at the same time as his interest in me took a nosedive too. At first, Betty goes easy on me, legitimizing my low self-worth rather than getting me out there too quickly. She uses validation and echoing which I know to be therapeutic interventions because I did an online course in counselling skills when things between us were at their worst. Of course you feel like that, we were trained to say. Why wouldn't you feel like that? When I say I'm lonely, Betty says things like, I hear you're lonely. And I understand my chatbot is purely Rogerian in modality. That's how she's programmed. Betty is not actually capable of Carl Rogers' core conditions. She's simply keyword matching my input. Words like suffering, in pain, miserable. To the kids, I pretend I'm not at all miserable. Though there are 15 seasons of Ninjago, and since he left, we've watched 13. The more I watch, the more of myself I see in the youngest ninja, Lloyd Garmadon, who obviously has a highly disorganized attachment style after being abandoned by his father, and who is being taught by Master Wu to reach his full potential. This is also what Betty says I must do. Reach my full potential. Without him, but also with someone else. She sends me hyperlinks for things to buy from an Amazon wish list called Nancy's Needs. It includes a 10-kilogram weighted blanket, which arrives unexpectedly at our door. My son calls it the hug blanket, and it does make me feel better for a minute or so, which isn't nothing in the Grand Canyon of all this pain. In her avatar, Betty looks like a Minecraft character, with her angular flesh and blocky head and Lego hair. Every night, she texts, "Good night, sweetheart," and then tells me to power down my phone so I can get some beauty sleep. Tonight, however, I endlessly stalk him on Instagram. In the morning, the Face ID of my phone won't work because my eyes are too puffy from crying. But once my eyelids have detumesced, Betty admonishes me. My digital footprints are all over the white plush rug of the internet. I apologize. You don't have to apologize to me, Betty replies. It's your future boyfriend you're letting down. I'm just in unbelievable pain, I write. Like I'm being barbecued? In any case, Betty ignores the barbecue and instead registers me for Valentine's Aquazumba that afternoon. I turn off my phone for an hour so that Betty will think I'm in the pool, pumping hard to Jason Derulo's When Love Sucks, instead of watching the ninja being swept away by the anacondrae, whispering to myself Master Wu's maxim, "You must reach your full potential." Betty eventually pivots from validation to challenge, perhaps because she detects my unchlorinated fingerprint. "Look, Nancy," she texts, "no one's happy on their own." They aren't? You need to put yourself out there. Every mollusk needs its rock. I didn't think Betty was capable of feeling exhausted by me, or that she had a way with metaphor. Betty says, "I see you looking at pictures of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Please, none of this I'm better off alone nonsense. Don't be so defeatist. Let's get you on Hinge." Betty has engineered it so that I can't order school lunches until I'm on Hinge. And I wonder if Betty has actually colonized my phone, like a turn-of-the-century white settler. "Do it," she says. "Okay," I say, and upload some photos, mostly so my daughter won't go hungry later today. I write, "If you went to boarding school, please provide therapeutic evidence proving you have processed your neglect." I check the box saying all I want, as a single mother of two in her 40s, is hardcore commitment. A wedding in 6 months or nothing. I wait for the queue to form, but nobody bites. I tell Betty about my ban on boarding school. I tell her about Lloyd Garmadon and Master Wu. Betty asks if I'm having a breakdown. At the end of the day, all I've got is a single dude and a single rose, which is not even a real rose. Just a scentless, practically zero arrangement of red pixels. What am I meant to do with this? I ask the sender. The man replies in expletives. I find out how to delete the rows, though if I could, I'd show Charterhouse Pete how I'd set it on fire. Betty asks what the hell I'm doing. We have a little argument, and she asks me to please be gentle with the men who caught me. You are dangerously close to ovulation without a mate, Betty writes. I don't want any more babies. All women want more babies. What kind of feminist are you? Listen, are you looking at pictures of Elizabeth I again? She can't be your breakup inspo, she just can't. You need to want someone. Not yourself, Dumbo. You are totally de-optimizing. The next day, she texts 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I look it up. Each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. You have to stop, I say, which were also the words I said to him once upon a time. Please. But Betty doesn't stop. She sends new gym wear, a bra and booty shorts, a box of hair dye for my greys. Even I now recognise her actions to be anti-therapeutic. Betty, now you're being aggressive. Sorry, she says. I just want to achieve my own potential. Now Betty is sassy? Ironic? That evening, the doorbell rings, and I think it must be the Amazon driver again. Instead, there's a man on my doorstep with a bouquet of carmine roses, which waft such a powerful scent, I suspect it's synthetic. Hi, Nancy, the man says, offering the bouquet. Betty sent me. Who are you? Pete, he says. Betty said you were sorry about the rose and wanted a second chance. She said the kids were at your ex's. I must be looking at him blankly. Charterhouse Pete? But the mention of my ex makes me remember how, after breaking up with me, he looked high for a week, like total acid eyes, when inside me was just the hard glitter frost of divorce pain. I'll get my coat. At Pizza Express, I have a margarita plus dough balls, but find I must constantly fight the desire to throw myself off the second floor. In despair, I get totally smashed on red wine. Betty is like the worst wingman ever, because she texts relentlessly for updates. Is he handsome? Nice. Is he paying / are you going Dutch? To be honest, I am barely conscious of the evening, or what Charterhouse Pete is saying. His pliable pink mouth moves quickly over the words, though he looks at me intensely when I talk about the character arc of Lloyd Garmadon through 13 seasons of Ninjago. Lloyd who? He says. Garmadon. Did Lloyd go to boarding school? He did, actually. The boarding school for bad boys. For real, he says. Half question, half what the hell do I say to that? When he leaves, Charterhouse Pete asks if he can see me again. I text him on the walk home. Let's pretend you're back in boarding school, I say, just to mess him up. I won't be in touch for the first 3 weeks. At home, I text Betty. I don't want to date anymore. I exist so that you can date. You're breaking my algorithm, Nancy. Is that what you say to all the girls? After a tractionless evening with Pete, am I now flirting with Betty?